I want to welcome everyone to this afternoon's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we'll be focusing on a recent book by Eileen Boris entitled Making the Woman Worker, Precarious Labor and the Fight for Global Standards 1919-2019, published by Oxford University Press. I'm Eric Arneson from George Washington University, the co-chair of the Washington History Seminar, and standing in today for my usual co-chair, Christian Osterman of the Wilson Center, is my old colleague and friend, Sonia Michel, who will be as well a discussant on Eileen Boris's book. The seminar is a collaborative venture of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association's National History Center. And for the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly, usually, if not always, on Mondays. We have 6 more sessions in November and December, and we'll have a full lineup soon to be announced for the new year. Behind the scenes are 2 people who make these seminars possible, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center. And I'd like to thank 2 institutional supporters, the LePage Center for History and the Public Interest and the George Washington University Department of History, as well as a number of anonymous individual donors. And as I say every week, we invite you to join their ranks. On the logistics front, you should know today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer session of this webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom. Those watching on Facebook Live, you can email questions to Rachel Wheatley, whose address is posted in the chat function. And we'll try to call on as many folks as we can. And with that, I will turn the screen over to Sonia Michel, who will introduce today's author. Sonia.
Thank you, Eric. It's really a pleasure to be here in general, but especially to introduce Eileen Boris, who is an old colleague and partner in crime. She brought me to Geneva when she was working on this book so that I could join in the fun at the ILO. I'm sure going to have a wonderful discussion. Eileen Boris is the Hull Chair and Distinguished Professor of Feminist Studies and History at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and she's president of the International Federation for Research in Women's History. Among her many books are Art and Labor, Ruskin, Morris, and the Craftsman Ideal in America, published in 1986, Home to Work, Motherhood and the Politics of Industrial Homework in the United States, which won the Philip Taft Prize in Labor History in 1995, Caring for America, Home Health Workers in the Shadow of the Welfare State, co-authored with Jennifer Klein, and winner of the Sara Whaley Prize on Women in Work in 2013, and 6 edited or co-edited volumes. And many of these, as I'll explain in my comment, are relevant to the book that we're here to discuss this afternoon, which is her most recent book, Making the Woman Worker, Precarious Labor and the Fight for Global Standards, 1919 to 2019, which was published last fall by Oxford University Press. So now I'm happy to welcome Eileen to the proceedings, and she will talk about her book.
Right. Well, thank you, Eric, and thank you, Sonia, and thank you, all of you who have come to this webinar. I'm going to share the screen. Let's see. Okay.
It worked.
All right. So I'm calling this talk Indispensable to All Working Women and to Mothers in the Home, Global Labor Standards in the Care Work Economy, 1919 to 2020. Making the Woman Worker argues that the past of feminized labor, part-time, temporary, low-wage, uncovered by labor standards or collective bargaining, opens a window into today's precarious world of work. But the labor standards regime, built on the concept of the woman worker as different from the male worker and the woman in the global South as different as other, was never complete nor unchallenged. There were makers to the making of the woman worker and to the definition of the home as outside of work. Global labor standards were one realm where conceptions of what is work and who is a worker became forged to reflect and reinforce power relations between nations, regions, genders, race, ethnicities, and classes, castes. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the operations of the International Labor Organization, or the ILO, the Geneva-based specialized entity first with the League of Nations and then the United Nations, an entity that I find good to think with. Through its unique tripartite structure representing states, organized workers, and employer associations, the ILO has brought together delegates to pass treaty-like conventions, aspirational counterweights to the vicissitudes of the market. Its office, which has global civil servants, has generated knowledge about the world of work, creating the very statistics and facts available to policymakers and scholars alike. These activities have characterized the woman worker rather than allowing laboring women to define themselves. Although in the last decade, some within the ILO have set about to do just that, provide an arena for informal domestics and other low-wage women to demand recognition and rights. Labor feminists, women in unions and their government and NGO allies, shaped initial labor standards impacting the woman worker. This is a photograph from 1919 from the International Congress of Working Women. Indispensable to all working women and to mothers in home. That's how the French organizer of garment outworkers, Jean Bouvard, characterized a proposal for the 8-hour day, 48-hour week, which a century ago became convention number 1 of the newly formed ILO. In differentiating mother in the home from all working women, she reinforced the separating of mother work from the world of employment that has haunted the formation of global labor standards. This binary, what some theorists refer to as productive and reproductive labor, others as paid and unpaid work, and the ILO as work and family responsibilities, cordon off care from employment. Until the 2000s, paid care work mostly stood outside of ILO deliberations, except for nursing actually, while unpaid family care became a concern as the means to enhance labor force participation and thus reinforce the valuing of care as a special kind of activity, one performed out of love or duty that loses its effectiveness when commodified to allow others to go out to work, with the assumption that any woman, any cisgender bio woman, can perform it, and with the prevalence of those who despise or other groups, classes, race, ethnicities, undertaking it, and particularly the dirty and physical aspects, the labor of care has come cheap, even when paid rather than embraced or forced. Devaluing of mothers in the home was not the intent of Beauvoir or the labor feminists of the early 20th century, who sought to relieve the double burdens of working class women, whether they labored in the home or other workplaces. The need for time to care for children and perform housework rationalized restrictions on women's labors on the job in contrast to men's, whose right to leisure was enough to demand an 8-hour norm. Such responsibilities especially justified reducing the labor market presence of pregnant workers and those who had returned to jobs after giving birth. Indeed, labor feminists believed maternity protection, which included medical care and income maintenance, should be universal. Well, Beauvoir attended the Washington International Labor Conference as a worker delegate, as an advisor to her country. She was among a handful of women who, as members of the Commission on Employment of Women, developed maternity and night work conventions against opposition of mostly male employer representatives. They were present at the International Labor Conference, or the ILC, because the ILO's constitution suggested that countries have women representatives when questions involving women workers were under discussion, an essentialist understanding of gender and sex that pervaded reform communities no less than the general public. These champions of women in industry wished to extend such protections to non-industrial occupations, but lost out in the larger discussion. Well, the dominant perspective within women's history has decried such women-specific labor standards as inhibiting equal employment. Such arguments echoed the legal equality feminists of the time who claimed that only equal treatment would do. Special treatment by definition led to inequality. Some feminist opponents of women-specific standards, such as Alice Paul of the National Woman's Party, whose image I've taken out because of copyright concerns, and I've done that throughout this talk, logically argued that so-called Native women should have the right to contract into bonded labor, otherwise all women would face workplace discrimination. Others in the British-led Open Door International offered a promising alternative, setting restraints or standards on the basis of the nature of the work for men as well as women. And here is the International Congress of the Women that preceded the first International Labor Congress. Now, the problem with that proposition of the open door was that the persistence of occupational segregation. Most ILO standards were gender neutral, but they had gendered and racialized impacts. Labor standards set perimeters to exploitation associated with employment. Some standards, however, were really what I call couches of protection. They dealt with morality, sexuality, or the civilizing mission. Specific standards applied only to certain workers, singled out by their gender, occupation, or geographic location. The latter often standing for workers and subsistence producers in colonized places racialized by Western Europeans, as well as indigenous people facing dispossession of land and livelihood. And these treaty-like conventions came into force upon ratification, but there were often huge loopholes that were added by the British and the French and the Belgians, which had these colonies at this time. So this topic then enters into the politics of the body and bodies, the way in which so-called tropical nations, as well as women, were assigned to social reproduction, not only the making of people, but really the production of goods for consumption in the global north. So special treatment of countries with special conditions. The home from the very beginning was a loophole. At first, with industrial labor as the norm and the white male Western worker as the ideal worker, labor standards generally failed to cover women, clustered in the home, including family enterprises and farming. Labor feminists saw that the sexual division of labor and assumptions about women's domesticity stood in the way of equal treatment, and thus only special provisions could level the playing field. But they came up against this understanding that the home couldn't really be a workplace, or if work took place there, then there was relatives, and it was a place that the labor inspector could not enter. Now, it was got around with one early convention, the facially gender neutral minimum wage fixing convention of 1928, which really focused on the garment industry and allowed for those industries without collective bargaining to either go to wage boards or laws. But this really represented something we see again and again. What gets passed often is to the interest of the male-dominated trade unions as much as to what the labor feminists might have wanted. Okay, let me do the next. Okay. The concern for caring labors transformed norms established with one group of women in mind into a universal standards. Special conventions targeted places without sovereignty and where unskilled labor lacked organization. Worry over reproductive labor and the stability of so-called native families pervaded discussions of the various special instruments, they were called, for dependent places, forced labor convention, and others that came later. These would limit the removal of men from their villages. At least women become camp followers. Men spend their earnings on drink and prostitution, and village life become disrupted. Women required protection from, as one put it, recruitment serving in moral ends. That is, from sex trafficking. In what we now call the global South, labor standards like equal pay or social insurance protections never were comprehensive enough to cover most women in income generators who either were subsistence producers, own account contractors, or denizens of the informal sector. And this is really what I mean by the civilizing mission and cultures of protection. Even for the global North, the home provided a challenge for advancing women's rights. These are images, I get mixed up with the right and the left with Zoom, but here is Mildred Fairchild, and here is Frida Miller of the US Women's Bureau. Fairchild was a US labor feminist from Grimoire, and she became the second head of the women's section of the ILO. And the two of them together were plotting from in and outside of the ILO in the late 40s into the early 50s before they both end up leaving the ILO for various reasons that I could talk about later. They tried to get conventions or some sort of instrument on domestic work, on industrial homework, on family responsibilities, but they could only end up at the end get a revision of the maternity protections. Now, by the 1950s, equality measures take center stage at the ILO. Two of the most important were Convention number 100 on equal remuneration and Convention 111 on anti-discrimination. The Article 52 is from the anti-discrimination, which again gives loopholes for treating pregnant workers and others with family responsibilities differently. They're considered as you're not discriminating if you don't treat them the same. In fact, that really came home in some of the discussion over the passage of Convention 111. We see this in committee deliberations. The Irish government delegate, for example, admitted that his country would be unable to ratify because in his country, to curb high unemployment, and this is in the 1957 or so, it prioritized hiring men, single women, and widows while barring married women, which he, to quote, would not be termed discrimination. In contrast, state socialist nations claimed that women had both equality, including equal remuneration, and protection, that such as maternity coverage. This doubleness resembled the continuing ILO position there should be equal treatment except when there was difference. In 1965, the ILC, the International Labor Conference, addressed family responsibilities directly by passing a recommendation targeted to women in its very name. And it was part of this Women Worker in a Changing World initiative, employment of women with family responsibilities. It was a lesser recommendation, so it didn't have a treaty-like status. It called for childcare facilities, coordination of transport and school hours with work schedules, and public facilities to lighten household tasks. Women delegates generally linked this recommendation to conventions on equal remuneration or equal pay for equal work, the protection of comparable, that's why they use equal remuneration, the protection of maternity, and non-discrimination is necessary for real equality. Some representatives offered a broader egalitarian claim, as a worker advisor, Sigfrid Ekendahl, a parliament member and former secretary of the Swedish Confederation of Trade Unions, put it, responsibility for children in the family is in general the same for the man as for the woman. The discussion of family responsibilities exemplified the intermingling of women's status with questions of global inequality, what would become commonplace in the 1970s when the UN system confronted South African apartheid and Palestinian question. Contradictions, though, pervaded these measures. And when the ILO began to make a gender turn by the early 1980s, this recommendation became a convention under workers with family responsibilities. And yet, the the impulse, of course, came from the recognition that men should participate more in family labor, but that it was still part of the problem of the woman worker. While some delegates claim that discrimination derived from the sex of the worker, others argue that equality would be moot if employers could dismiss any worker because they had to attend to child or other immediate family member. Now, when it came to rural women in the global South, a dedicated group of feminist development economists recast the reproductive labor of such subsistence and informal workers as essential to economic life. For me, this chapter of the book is the heart of the book. I guess when you're working on a project for a long time, there is a group of your protagonists that you end up saying, yes, they had the vision. But of course, the vision did not fully materialize until later. In standard accounting, rural women turned into casualties of underdevelopment and victims of traditional society. But the staff of the program of the rural women, including Zubi Ahmed, Martha Lofty, and for a short time, the Spanish-born, but most of her career was in the US, Marxist feminist economist, Lourdes Benaria, pushed for changing the definition of the worker to abolish the separation of the so-called productive work from reproductive work, eventually resulting in defining housework as work, as they put it. They understood how domestic labor directly facilitated capital accumulation. Unrecognized reproductive labor allowed for the low wages of the global supply chain. The program was a prefigurative initiative, funding major studies on women and development. Excuse me, let me go back one. Here are some of their funding of their work. And what they did is they sought to fund researchers in the global South in conjunction with local groups. That is, the program sought to decolonize knowledge through participatory research. In fact, by 2013, the Conference on the International Labor Statisticians caught up with these development feminists by redefining work as activities, and I quote, that produces goods and services for household consumption, such as collecting firewood and fuel, fetching water, cooking, cleaning, and also providing care for children, the elderly, and other dependents. Now, whether nations would do their accounting, however, is still ongoing. That women in developing countries had distinct concerns never meant that they should not have equal treatment. Home-based and domestic workers would demand inclusion in labor standards beginning in the 1980s in conjunction with some of the women staffers at the ILO. The home-based workers, led by the Self-Employed Women's Association of Gujarat in India, Mrs. Renata Jabawa, who was one of their leaders under El Abad at the time, they really mobilized a global campaign, which led to the Homework Convention of 1996. And that's actually how I got sucked into the ILO as a topic, because in 1989, I was part of a consult in that went to Ahmedabad, India, where the SEVA is located, to get researchers around the world when the ILO was attempting to figure out, could they do a convention about home-based work? And it was my work on industrial homework that brought me into that discussion. And I was curious about the ILO ever since, actually. And it was really this convention, which very few nations actually have ratified, and the employers walked out, and it really set the stage for a narrowing for a while of what the ILO could do. But it also set the stage for considering the home as a workplace deserving of labor standards. Subsequent campaigns for recognizing reproductive labor as work like any other, despite unique characteristics, would challenge the very protocols and the organization of the ILO. And we particularly see that in the campaign of decent work for domestic workers, which really was a shot in the arm and gave the ILO new global relevance, the passage of that convention in 2011. It's worth looking for a moment at some of the tactics here. And I'm just going to show you very briefly a couple of images about that and then go to my conclusion. Here is a poster from the campaign of domestic workers are workers. And it's that kind of argument and showing the varieties of labor that came under, including home care, attendant labor, that came under this notion of domestic work or a care work economy. And the convention attempted to place this form of feminized labor into whatever existing labor standards. But of course, that's always the catch-22, because what if there are no labor standards or very little in a given country? Okay, so one of the tactics used was organizational capacity building and training. WIGO, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, and the IUF, the International Union of Food, Agricultural, Hotel, and Restaurant Workers, were really key in training what was a network of a global network of domestic worker associations and unions. This woman's from Peru. Guillermo is from San Francisco, from the Day Laborer Group, and now is a leader in Mujeres Unidas Activista. So there was learning about constant messaging and training on how to get around the ILO bureaucracy. There also were activist strategies, and these images are from my colleague, Jennifer Fish, who I've co-authored with. And they took to the streets, which wasn't usually done because the ILO does not have a formal way for NGOs to really enter into its process except through either the governments or the trade unions. Let me go back one again. They also used what I call the politics of affect. This is an image from the transit workers campaign from Singapore, which I had permission to use for an article that was in Feminist Studies. And it was the notion that she's not just your maid, she has a life, give her a day off, dignity overdue. So it was this part of this appeal to the heart of the employers. Finally, we can see how with the passage, what was the International Domestic Worker Network became the International Domestic Workers Federation, a new global labor federation that is woman-run and women-dominated. This image was from the first Congress of the new federation in Uruguay, which I had the privilege to attend as a note taker. And this was the image that the poster used for the conference. And so the solidarity created a new mechanism for the ratification campaigns, which have been much more forthcoming than in many other ILO. I think they're up to about 30 countries have ratified and changed their laws. Okay, I'm gonna conclude now. In the early 21st century, the ILO spoke about unpaid family labor and recognized that care work, like household employment, existed as an occupation and thus required protocols and regulations. The care sector suffered from the lack of acceptance that such labor was work in the first place. As it approached its centennial in 2019, which is why I had to get my book done by then, domestic work became linked with a re-emphasis on family responsibilities packaged as care, a component of the Women at Work initiative. And there was also a turn at this point of reconsidering the home-based labor convention with the new world of digital platforms and what it might mean for women as opposed to men and other people with dependent care as opposed to those without it. Diallo argued that the lack of work-family balance or access to care, what became known as the care deficit, blocked the way to equality in the world of work. And this highlighting of the centrality of reproductive labor really was part of the Women in Work initiative, and gender equality was placed at the center of looking forward. There were many specific about flexitime and public resources that had been talked about in the past, but they were brought together. And the claim of the current Director General, if we fail to deliver on gender equality, the attainment of decent work for all will be illusionary, framed centennial efforts. But just fixing women was not enough if men stayed the same. And he argued that as well. Guy Ryder from the British trade union movement. With gender updating women, the meaning of equality remained fraught. It is in this context that the words of domestic workers and their advocates during debates over Convention 189 underscore the centrality of care work. As one representative of the International Domestic Workers argued in 2010, we are the oil in the wheels. It is our work in households that enables others to go out and be economically active. It is us who take care of your precious children and your sick and elderly. We cook your food to keep you healthy, and we look after your property when you are away. It took workers themselves to push for revaluing the quotidian labors of daily life, the work that makes all other work possible. The question remained, even knowing what could be done, would nations do so to benefit all working women and mothers in the home, and thus us all? Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Our discussant today is my co-chair, Sonia Michel, who is Professor Emerita of History, American Studies, and Women and Gender Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. And she's the former director of the United States Studies program of the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars here in Washington, D.C. She's the author of Children's Interests, Mothers' Rights, The Shaping of America's Child Care Policy, published by Yale University Press in 1999. She's the editor of multiple collections, including Gender and the Long Post-War, Reconsiderations of the United States and the Two Germanys, co-edited with Karen Hageman, and published by the Woodrow Wilson Center Press with Johns Hopkins University Press in 2014. I am delighted that she will be discussing Eileen's book. And with that, I turn the Zoom screen over to you, Sonia.
Thank you, Eric. And thank you, Eileen, for a wonderful attempt at summarizing what is such a rich and amazing book that it's really hard to do justice to it in the time allotted. Making the Woman Worker was hardly a straightforward process, as Eileen explains convincingly in this savvy and comprehensive book. Women face two problems in their struggles to be recognized as workers. First, their status and duties as wives and mothers on the one hand, and second, the kinds of work that they tended to do, much of it in the home, either theirs or someone else's. In other words, they were either working for their own families, and that was not recognized as work, or certainly not paid work, or they were working for someone else's family, and that was not considered to be work because that was just like the work they did in their own home. So it was hardly worthy of a very, very generous compensation. Eileen Boris was just the person to undertake this project of understanding the struggles for making the woman worker. As you could probably tell from the titles that I reeled off in my intro and some of the ones that she mentioned in her talk, she has been interested in the processes of work and who performs it from her very first book, Art and Labor, which explored the creativity of craftspeople's labor in Britain and the United States. She went on in her many subsequent books on women's to examine women's relationship to work, both in factories and in the home. Women have performed many types of paid labor, from industrial outwork to most recently domestic work and the work of care, what she and Precarious have called intimate labors. In each of her studies, Eileen has directed our attention to the ways in which various types of human activities have failed to be recognized as work, why this has occurred, and the consequences of this non-recognition. Most of her earlier books, with the exception of the first one, Art and Labor, focused on women workers in the United States. But in 2010, she began to widen her scope to explore women in their work internationally. Actually, she started this earlier, as she explained in her talk, but her publications really began in 2010, starting with Intimate Labors, which was published in 2010, co-edited with Precarious, which looked at a range of jobs involving people's bodies and personal experience around the world. And then in 2015, she continued her international explorations with Caring for America, co-authored with another historian, Jennifer Klein, which looked at internationalism in a different way by examining the important role of migrants in performing the work of care for children, elders, the ill, and those with disabilities in the US. A key contribution of both of these books, in addition to their internationalism, was to identify intimate labor, including care work, as work. Thus, manicurists, call center operators, and surrogate mothers were no less workers than die cutters, lumberjacks, plumbers, or CEOs. Much of Eileen Boris's previous work focused on the relationship, or more often the non-relationship, between women workers and organized labor, trade unions, whether in the US or in other countries where women were living and working. But beginning in the early 2010s, Eileen began adding a new dimension to her research by looking at the role of international organizations in supporting women workers' ongoing struggle for recognition. As we have heard in her talk, these organizations operate in several different ways, mobilizing and identifying these women as workers, analyzing their working conditions, including the causes for discrimination or the rationales for discrimination, exploitation, and even the abuse that they regularly experience, and then working to win and ensure their rights around the globe. One, the ILO is of course concerned with all types of labor. And as Eileen and her co-editors and the contributors to her 2012 volume, Women's ILO, have demonstrated, it took some convincing to get the ILO to acknowledge women's work as work. Other international organizations, often coalitions or federations of dozens of national groups, such as the International Domestic Workers Federation, are concerned with specific categories of women workers, and they need no convincing as to the importance of their cause. Now, in making the woman worker, Eileen has built on this exceptionally strong foundation to take her research to new levels, showing how these two very different types of organizations, one a high-level agency of the UN, that is the ILO, the other is often bare bones grassroots formations, encountered and interacted with one another within the context of the ILO. But the book is even more than that, of course. Beginning in 1919, Eileen traces the complexities of the debates over women's work, showing how male occupations and their life histories became the norm against which women's working lives were compared and found wanting, or at least incompatible, and thus not worthy of the same rights and protections that male workers were to enjoy. Eileen has been able to deepen our understanding of these debates by exposing their roots in similar discussions at the national level in many member states, which influenced debates at the ILO through the interventions of the representatives, the national representatives who made up the tripartite structure of the ILO, which included governments, employers, and workers. At the same time, drawing on her careful sifting through ILO archives, Eileen is able to tell us who was on the ILO staff at any given moment, what skills and experiences they brought to their jobs, and how this often shaped what appeared on the agenda and how it was discussed. Many of these people were women, but there was also one director general in particular, Somavia, I forget what his term was.
Director.
anyway, the 90s, I think. And that was really important. I mean, he really turned the tide by talking about decent work, creating this category of decent work and saying that all workers, including women, should have decent work. By the end of the 20th century, Eileen argues, the addition of many women to the proceedings, both as representatives and as staff members, clearly laid the groundwork for the eventual passage of Conventions 177, dealing with home-based work, and 189, which addresses domestic work. As if all of this, including the pioneering research on the inner workings of the ILO and their impact on women, were not enough, Professor Boris also sets this history of women workers' struggles for recognition in the context of both local labor economies and economic globalization. Chapter 5 on home-based outwork is a good example of this. Here, drawing insights from her own 1994 work on industrial outwork in the US, Home to Work, here Eileen provides a richly detailed picture of Indian women's strenuous efforts to support themselves and their families through all sorts of endeavors, both on a contract basis with industries and in work that was on their own account. She then shows how, against all received wisdom, that such workers were impossible to organize because they were scattered throughout in private homes throughout the country. Women labor leaders, most notably Ella Bat and her Self-Employed Women's Association, otherwise known as SEWA, helped to mobilize these workers and begin to improve their working conditions. Boris goes on to explain how SEWA and other organizations like it around the world became the building blocks for international women's labor coalitions around home-based and industrial work, eventually producing organizations like the International Domestic Workers Network and then the International Domestic Workers Federation. And it was these organizations that were in turn supported by, and not labor-specific NGOs like WeGo, which helped to train them and prepare them for their work in the ILO. And it was these organizations that broke through all sorts of barriers at the ILO, not least the unwritten but powerful rules for proper decorum at that fusty bastion of worker rights. I could go on at length about the virtues and achievements of this book, but there isn't time and we want to hear from the rest of you. Let me at least note that the prodigious research that went into this book in a wide range of archives that clearly yielded a plethora of material, documents that required many different types of skills to interpret and deep knowledge of women's labor history in countries across the globe in order to contextualize them. All of us historians know what that kind of work entails. But let me pose a couple of questions to start our discussion. First, Eileen, in your book, Caring for America, you and Jennifer Klein discuss the shaping and growth of care work, especially by migrant women in the US, within the context of the American welfare state, or mostly its absence and its shortcomings. As a historian of gender in the welfare state myself, I wonder, in the international debates over domestic and especially care work at the ILO and elsewhere, did the subject of welfare states ever come up? Did the status of welfare provisions in different member states, like Sweden, for example, shape their positions on domestic and especially care work and care workers? Do you think there was some fear on the part of women workers that, say, more robust welfare state development in wealthier countries might actually inhibit opportunities for migrant women workers from the developing world? Or to put it another way, do you think that because the ILO is primarily a labor organization, it tends to downplay factors such as welfare state development? That's my first question. Want to go ahead?
Do you want me to answer that, or?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Sonia. I mean, it's wonderful when people understand a trajectory in one's career that things make sense. Sometimes you don't realize it until years later, that art and labor actually considers some of these same issues about what is work and who can be a worker. In terms, the ILO is a labor right organization, which means it's concerned with employment and its understanding of work. That's why it takes so long, I think, for the ILO to understand unpaid labor, which it but it does, from the beginning, it is concerned with social provision, what we would think of the components of welfare states, like Social Security in this country. And that's because the anti-communist social democrats from France and Britain who formed the ILO as a bulwark against Bolshevism were also founders of welfare states. And so the extent to which employment relates to social provision, unemployment, workmen's compensation, accident, for accidents, maternity benefits could be seen as part of that. Then these social welfare issues get folded into the ILO. Now, but social welfare is a secondary concern of the ILO. And the whole UN system expands, of course, with the anti-colonial struggles of the newly independent states, with transformations in the state socialist countries, the fall of the Soviet Union, the ending of the Cold War, and migration, which at the very beginning in the 1920s, the ILO was the group that looking at migration, loses that after World War II. But migration by the 1970s has become more and more important. And what would decent labor standards mean for migrant workers? And it doesn't directly represent what it might mean if you have public provision of childcare, if you have cleaning services, if you remove labor from the home. There is assumption that different states will have different configurations. And that has always been the challenge of creating global standards. They're really the least common, it's the common denominator. So that's what I would say about that. It has not addressed that potential contradiction.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I was really trying to get at is, did they ever think about women, especially, and especially migrant women, as being the employees, as performing welfare state functions, as possible employees of welfare states?
Yeah, I mean, not directly. I certainly see it that way. That I do think they're doing the work of the welfare state. Certainly we show that in Caring for America, where it is a state funding that makes home care, even private home care, possible. But they don't really talk about it in that term. It's in recent documents and discussions at the ILO. On one hand, you have the looking at the necessity of dealing with care that is understood as a barrier to women's full labor force participation. And then on the other hand, how the care work economy of the paid jobs, some of which are state supported when you look at teachers or social workers and such, but also domestic workers, has to be uplifted. But it's almost like they're two tracks.
Right. Well, that's great. That's sort of what, yeah, interesting to be continued. Okay, my second question is your chapter on the IDWF and its allies in campaigning for adoption of C-189 at the ILO is wonderfully colorful, and I hope people will read it. And it's often actually amusing to read about some of the things, some of the antics that they use. And the participants' energy and creativity are very apparent. You also emphasize their strategic use of the stories, stories that you call the politics of affect, the stories about their own experiences of slavery and suffering, to arouse sympathy on the part of the representatives, the ILO representatives, while also noting that it was possibly counterproductive in that it presented these workers more as victims than as these women more as victims than as workers with agency and rights. So I have two questions. First, can you say more about how important that strategy was? And second, and do you think that women would have won C-189 without it? And second, would that kind of strategy have worked for male workers? And since you know so much about the history of the ILO, have you ever seen instances in which men deployed anything like that? And what impact did it have?
Yeah, I haven't seen that, although I have with seafarers. Well, Leon Fink would know that more than I. I mean, the descriptions of the brutality on ships, and you do get that. So the valiant proletarian of the sea, the heroic proletarian of the sea, when they get on land, they get fleeced by prostitutes and ale houses, etc. So they become sort of a victim, and you get these stories, but they're not told by the workers themselves. They're told by some advocates and the NGOs of the time. And I particularly looked at that from the 1920s, actually, in the early 1930s. And this whole use of the testimony of the worker, we can go back. I mean, I found in doing Home to Work, the way in which the girl strikers or the garment workers, and we see this in some of the solidarity campaigns into the present, they come around and they tell their stories. And it's a fundraising, and it's also an appeal to the heart, and to, whether we're talking about Rana Plaza or, the ILG back in the day. And it is an effective strategy to appeal to bourgeois audiences. But would another strategy be as effective? Well, these stories are true. So we can't discount it. But it's very hard to be portrayed as a Scrooge like figure, and some of the employers would say, "Oh, said they couldn't vote. They could not vote for 189, understanding that it wasn't really going to cost them." So that's another question there.
Great. Eric, we have people in the queue?
We do, but we can continue the conversation as the time
you may have
progresses.
questions too.
So before we open this up, and I should just say to folks who wish to ask questions, you can write them to us in the chat function, the question and answer function, Q&A on Zoom. Gives us these questions very clearly. You can raise your hand and we can call on you, though you'll have to unmute yourself. So there are multiple ways to pose questions, and those on Facebook can write to Rachel Wheatley, whose email address is provided. Before we open it up, I'm wondering if you could just give us a bit more by way of nuts and bolts. The ILO is not necessarily an institution that is well known here in the United States. And so if you could just say a little bit about how it's structured, how it functions, and what's the relationship between what it concludes in the realm of conventions and the real world.
Yeah.
How does it manifest itself in countries around the world? So the ILO will say something, then what happens? So if you could just walk us through some of those steps.
Yeah, I sort of cut that out, my ILO 101, because I was afraid it would take too long.
Well, now you get the chance.
Yes, now I get that. Okay, so the ILO comes out of World War I. It's in the Treaty of Versailles, and it's part of the negotiations, and it really is seen as a counter to Bolshevism. It is tripartite, so it means it's organized to have employer representatives, which are the peak employer associations. It has trade unions and has governments, but the governments get 2 votes for every nation that belongs. It is also organized tripartite with 3 sections. It likes trinities, I guess. It has the International Labor Conference that meets almost every year. There was a few times in its history that it didn't meet. That where policies are discussed, there's proclamations, there's protocols, there is the conventions and recommendations that are non-binding to pass. But they're only passed after the work of the office, which is under an elected director general, who also presides over the governing body. And the office is the staff. And these bureaus that are connected within the office change. It's so complicated. It took a long time to figure this out, and sometimes to find things within the Byzantine structure of the ILO, because names change all the time of the offices and such. But they often have these like sectorial committees. Let me take the example of the industrial homework. There would be like the footwear industry, or the textile industry, or the clothing industry, and they would be tripartite too. They would have representatives in these discussion groups that are gathering information and trying to set what the primitives of policy should be for employers, workers, and governments. But it would be the office with the governing body that would determine which countries would be for which one. And because of the power of the US for many years, under David Morse from the late 40s until the early 70s, the director general was from the US. The US and the USSR did not join the ILO till I think it was 34 or 36. Yeah, I think it was 34. They both joined then. And it becomes an arena where the Cold War is played out later on, as well as the anti-colonial struggles. So you have these committees and they make recommendations. The office for any convention sends out these questionnaires to the governments, and the trade unions and the employers can answer the official, and then they make proposals, and then goes out again, and then et cetera. So a lot is gathered. And they also do various studies and technical cooperation, going to different countries to help them set up labor bureaus, or sometimes even development projects when they get funded by other entities to do that. Okay, there's a lot of activity. But what about the real world? And to the extent that these conventions get passed, often there is many countries that the convention actually parallels what they already have. And so you want to level the playing field for international trade competition, quite frankly. But some countries then use the ILO to remake their standards, their labor standards. Other countries just ignore it and they never ratify. Or the US tries to determine it and is only ratified about 12 or 13 of ILO conventions historically. But what it acts as aspirational, so that a group of workers can take the ILO standard, bring it into their country, as was done with the domestic workers, but Eloisa Bellotti was on from Italy, and she shows how the equal remuneration in Italy came out of using the ILO struggle on the ground, using that standard. So people then, it's a dialectic of organizing in standards. You organize to get a standard, then you take the standard on the international level and you bring it back, and then you use it through the ratification process and as a struggle for your on the ground. And we see that with the domestic workers around the world. We've seen that with equal pay, and even with the home-based labor, although the women in India were not that successful on the national level. But that's why they went to the ILO, because they were blocked in the national level. I hope that begins to answer that question.
Yes, indeed. We have a hand up with Hillary Silver. So if you could unmute yourself, Hillary, you can ask your question.
Good to hear you again.
How are you, Eileen? It's been a while.
Back in our homework days.
Back in our homework days, exactly. I don't know how to put on my video. I don't see a way to do it, but I'm going to. Is that right, Eric? I can't
Yes, so we just hear your voice
just hear me.
and the power of your words.
There you go. So interestingly enough, I consulted at the ILO for probably 5 to 10 years, not on questions of homework, but on social exclusion for the Social Summit in Copenhagen. And at that time, I learned quite a bit about the machinations of international bureaucrasies. So let me tell you a couple of things that I thought were relevant to your presentations, both yours and Sonia's. One thing is that the ILO, when it comes to resolutions and when it comes to social policy prescriptions, really has to be seen from the perspective of a kind of corporatist model where you have social partners and they are seen as constituents.
Right.
And employers, therefore, have a big role to play in vetoing any kind of resolution that they see as too radical, of course. So, and it also, you know, took on that male breadwinner model where you should get your benefits through bargaining and employment. So this is one reason why women are then sidelined in the organization. And when you look at the structure of the ILO, you see that the women's initiative, or whatever that's called now, was sort of segregated, and it's its own thing. And you still have that kind of segregation of concerns with women's work in all the international organizations. So like in the World Bank, you have women in development, right? So women's work is concerned with getting female employment to help the country develop, right? So that was one of the things. And also this decent work idea came out of Guy Standing, as far as I understand it.
Well, he thinks it did, but actually, yeah, there's some debate of that. He told me it was his idea. Yeah.
Right. Well, he'll take credit for that sort of thing.
Yeah, Guy's quite something else.
So my question is this, though. One of the things that was interesting to during the years I was there, and in the International Institute for Labor Studies, which is where the researchers were located, was they were all pushing for universal basic income.
Right.
And now it's an idea, time seems to have come with Pete Buttigieg and others. And of course, Chris Van Parijs has been pushing this for many years. Philippe Van Parijs pushed it. So there's now an international basic income push, which would provide women in reproductive work with basic income, where they wouldn't have to, you know, they go outside the corporatist model of employer-employee relations. So I was wondering what you thought of that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for bringing your experience and your knowledge, both as an academic and as a participant to this discussion, Hillary. Yeah, basic income, which is Guy Standing's right now, you know, critique of the ILO, which he was pretty important in a number of times. And the ILO, as I said, the ILO is laborite and it is corporatist. That's what, you know, the tripartite is. And it'll be fascinating to see if it can embrace basic income, really. This is something that many feminists, and I think of Kathy Weeks's work right now, find very promising. And so we'll just have to see. It was, just today, Robert Kuttner in the American Prospect was talking and says, Biden should come out with basic income. He should bring the people from Alaska, who after all have been getting this universal grant out of the oil revenues for many, many years, these Republican voters, and parade them in Washington to show how much people like basic income. The question is, at $1,000 a year, or $2,000 a year, you know, how can you scale up this notion of basic income? But thank you. Yes, the male breadwinner model was quite there.
Eric, could I just chime in for a second?
Of course.
Yeah, Eileen, Hillary's question reminded me of something that occurred to me.
Mhm.
You talk and with this, when you're talking about struggles for compensation for care work and so forth, what's the relationship between that kind of argument and wages for housework? And are you treading on similar kinds of tricky ground?
Yeah. Oh, wages for housework was always a provocation anyway. I mean, it was an organizing tactic. They didn't really, Sylvia and them really, it was asking for universal basic income.
Yeah.
No, it was a provocation. I like to add at that. But it does decenter one's social welfare, to use your term, from employment. And that is very important when the future of work looks grim, or work as we've known it. So we have to think about what could be. And, I'm not a utopian thinker, I'm a historian.
We have a hand up with Cornelia Weiss. If you unmute yourself, you can pose a question.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Cornelia Weiss, and I thank both of you. This is absolutely terrific. Would you be willing to educate me as to the debate on protective legislation? So, for example, the Night Work Convention. What were the arguments for and what were the arguments against? Who prevailed, and did that change?
Yeah.
And why?
Yes, night work. Well, thank you for that question, Cornelia. We could spend the rest of our time on that. But the Night Work Convention was the most contentious of the so-called protective, or the women-only protections, because for many women workers, it was discriminatory, and it did lock them out of jobs. The labor feminists thought that women should not have, until you could have organizing, etc., women should not have to do two jobs. That over the years, you get the Night Work Convention is the one that gets chipped away over and over and over. So more and more exceptions, women managers, women professionals. And so you begin getting that changed even in the 1930s, and then in the late 40s. And then by the time it becomes gender neutral, which I think is the early 90s, I could be wrong in that, you see that there's no protection for any workers. And this is what happens with the part-time work too, that it become, and there Hillary's point about the employer influence comes in. So all workers is, so it's, I think when we begin to think about protective legislation as labor standards rather than as discrimination against women workers, we can make more finely grained analysis. And that is one, that's why I spent some time on that in my discussion, because I want to break through the dichotomy as we've understood it in women's history, that by definition, if not everybody is treated the same, then you're going to have discrimination against women workers, the legal equality. But in an unequal world, sometimes equality, it just puts you need something that is proactive rather than a level playing field for the lowest paid unorganized workers. There's also the arguments that men made was women have to do their duties at home, women are it's going to be dangerous in the street, you have to protect motherhood. That's a little different than the way the labor feminists were looking at it, but the labor feminists win that one initially, precisely because their understanding of women's double day fits into the male protective arguments. It doesn't contradict it. The women that are fighting the night work are mostly professional women. So, or they're dominated by professional women, those organizations. But it is the one that gets chipped away and chipped away and chipped away. And by really by the 70s, it's very hard to justify it.
Ironically, I mean, I may be something of a throwback here, but I've been having debates with people lately talking about childcare, and some people are pushing for the availability of 24-hour childcare at night.
Yeah.
I worry about that because I can imagine like a single mom who has a night work job, is who knows what, doing, possibly being a care worker, you know, working in a nursing home or something like that at night. And she has childcare for her child at night. She brings the child somewhere where the child sleeps. Then at the end of her shift, she picks up the child and goes home. And she doesn't necessarily have childcare during the day. When is she supposed to sleep? I mean, she's you know, stuck taking care of her child or children all day, and then she's got to go back and work at night. So, and there's a way in which having access to 24-hour childcare or night childcare enables, you know, on the other hand, on one hand, it enables her to work, but it also enables employers to have access to these women workers. And I'm stuck about how to address it. I mean, if you don't provide 24-hour care, then or night child care, then children may be left by themselves or, you know, in some kind of risky situation. But on the other hand, if you provide it, then it enables what is really a kind of double exploitation of women. So it's a tricky thing.
Came back to reorganizing the gender division of labor. And of course, one of the dilemmas I always face as someone who teaches in feminist studies and works in that field is that the categories of all these documents, of all the statistics, of all the studies, you know, assume we know what we mean by women and men. And that's, you know, that's always, all that is solid melts into air. But, you know, that is, and it's a real problem. And there, Camille Babogalio, I'm mispronouncing her name, has a really good argument about the feminist argument for 24-hour childcare, community-based, women-controlled, is different than the corporate argument to extend the working day. But whether it would mean anything in practice is a whole other story.
Thank you. We have a question that has come in from the question and answer function on Zoom. This one from Leon Fink, who asks, in contrast to the tripartite structure of the ILO, it seems from the narrative that the driving force for women's labor reforms were the networks of women labor activists outside all three or in tension with all three branches. If so, what are the implications?
Good question. I see a insider-outsider strategy there, that the ILO, women find the ILO good to struggle with and through. So Alice Paul and the legal equality women in the 1930s designate the ILO as the main enemy towards women around the world. Bit of an exaggeration, I would say, but because of the protective or the women only laws. Meanwhile, the international YWCA and many other women's organizations use the ILO to promote their understanding of social welfare and of the woman worker. And we see the way in which the women in the office, in the very underfunded and tenuous section on women, that's women and child workers, women, children, and old age workers, under-resourced, how they act over time and with women's organizations globally. So you really do get whatever action there is about women or care work or home labors comes from that synergy, because the ILO focused on industrial work first and extractive industries like, you know, the seafarers, maritime, as you know, was very big, mining and such. male-dominated sections. Agriculture was almost an afterthought, though it was there. And so the industries that women dominated, because they were less organized, were not as important.
Thank you. We have a question from an anonymous attendee who writes, "Thanks for writing this book. I am really looking forward to reading it. Having done research on ILO and women workers in India, I'm interested in how you see the precise operation of difference, quote unquote, in the 1920s and 1930s. Was the distinction between productive and reproductive labor more or less pronounced in Europe and the US than in Asia and Africa, where we also see many workers expelled from mines and mills by regulations?"
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It really is. And, you know, all inhabitants of colonized areas were considered different. And then there's gender difference within that. And I find it offensive, the actual titles of some of these quote unquote native workers notions. And the idea that people's cultures and relationships, social relationships, are lesser than the Europeans and they have to be uplifted. So you have that working. There's one wonderful quote, I think it's from, and I think it's an Irishman again, I'm not trying to pick on the Irish really, who talks about, and the ILO comes in, you know, you have a Bible in one hand and the ILO conventions in the other to civilize these places. I mean, okay. We know that the division of labor in many countries is different than the European and the industrial West. You have a displacement, whether we're talking about much of the rural Americas, Latin America, or we're talking about India, people from the land. We have subsistence producers who are not initially recognized in the ILO's understanding of anything until the 1970s, when the notion of the informal economy, and there's a study on Nigeria that really brings that to the forefront, even though there's other people in the World Bank and other places thinking about the informal economy. So both sexual divisions of labor and the relationship of informality, formal sectors, colonized sectors, the impact of global supply chains, which like destroys Ahmadabad's textile industry, and the way in which men get displaced and the women do home-based labor, outwork. And that's a process that really, you know, begins by the late 40s that's happening. So these are very complicated issues, and I look forward. Anonymous, you can email me if you want to have further conversation. Thank you.
So I have a question that struck me throughout the book, but was kind of crystallized at the end of your conclusion. And you cite a poll that is done in the last number of years, commissioned by the ILO and Gallup, that sampled men and women in 142 locations worldwide, that found women desired employment, you say. Men agreed. Yet women faced obstacles from an inability to undertake care while earning income, lack of work-family balance, and access to care, what became known as the care deficit, blocked the way to equality in work. And I remember when I was reading Sonia's book a good number of years ago in arguments about childcare policy, and I'm reminded here that the larger gender division of labor in the household, in the home, is something that either goes largely uncommented upon or is accepted, certainly by men who are quite content with this, but through much of the 20th century by women as well. And I'm wondering the extent to which the various groups that you are writing about here in the variety of countries have grappled with or tackled the gender division of labor in the household, which it seems from much of what you write, is the big obstacle to equality and women's participation in the outside economy or even in the internal economy?
Lip service. I see it as lip service. The ILO. I'm glad that the current director general mentions it, that men have to do it too. But if you look at everything that's specifically, it's all about women's labor force participation. So give me a break. But some of the Nordic countries and Sweden do, even though they're not perfect, as we well know, they do raise these issues very early on. They're talking about it in the 60s, early on for the ILO story, with the debate over having a family responsibility instrument. The state socialist countries sort of say, well, women are equal, we give them public provision, but they don't talk about reorganizing the gender division of labor. So I think that is a very persistent problem. I used to begin my syllabuses in women's history syllabuses. One of the quotes was from Nancy Shutterow, women mother, because that to me seemed to be a really, really big problem. That this is the assumption that guides everything. On the other hand, there's some women who feel that they don't want to trust men. They are untrustworthy. And is that because of socialization? Is it because one wants to keep on something that you have expertise? So it's complicated. I'd love to hear a couple more questions, because I can answer anything, and Sonia can too, forever.
I'm going to ask the question that Christian Osterman often will ask, and that has to do with sources and how you go about writing a book like this. Sonia talked about your immersion in ILO archives and other archives as well. If you could just talk a little bit about that, A, and B, you also offer us multiple case stories of grassroots or local organizing in which women come together and fight for rights in whatever sector that their organizations represent. How do you go about writing those stories, which I assume are not always or necessarily or even often found in the more traditional archives of the ILO or elsewhere?
Yeah, good question. Okay. I had to make a decision early on that if this was going to be a transnational story, how was I going to do it? So I decided to focus my research on the ILO and in their voluminous archives, because not only do you have bureaucratic information there, and you can trace often what's happening within the bureaucracy and among the components of the ILO, which took a while to figure out. But you also have all these reports. You have country reports, you have studies, and you have correspondence. So it was a way to be broad as well as deep. Now, that didn't mean I didn't use other archives. I found some of the archives in the Frederick Ebing outside of Cologne, in Bonn, for some of the international labor federations. I used some UN archives, although I found the archives in New York less rich than I would have wanted. I used League of Nations archives in Geneva. I found the US archives in the US really useful. The Women's Bureau, the Department of State, the Department of Labor. And there often would be materials in there. Also, some of the key players like Frida Miller, and Clara, oh God, I'm having a senior moment, from the Department of Labor, Clara Bayer, who I knew before she died. I mean, how can I have a senior moment on Clara? Well, and their papers are at Schlesinger, and there were Esther Peterson's papers were in Schlesinger. So I worked with those kinds of archives as well. Then, but for the more recent, there was a review of my book in the Women's Social Movement that said, well, the first part is really very much based on, the internal stuff of the ILO, the women, but towards the end, the last chapter is very much, these grassroots women's groups and stuff. I mean, the historical ones there with papers at the Schlesinger, at the Library of Congress, etc. National Women's Party, the National Working Women's Federation and such. But it helped to know people. So I did do both formal and informal interviews with people. And I talked and did email exchanges with people like Dan Gallen of the IUF, of Renana Jabala from SEWA. And then for the more contemporary, I was following it in the news. I met with and I've given solidarity with the International Domestic Workers Federation, and then people would share materials. And then I know people now in the ILO staff, so I would interview people that really were connected with the grassroots.
Thank you.
So that's the way I could do that.
I mean, you edited a book with Dorothea Hutker, who's on the
she's on.
Could you talk a little bit about that experience? I mean, did you feel like you had different perspectives, or you meshed, or?
No. And Sonia is in that book. I see that. No, it was fantastic, and with Susan Zimmerman, because Susan is an expert in the interwar period, so that was really good. And Dorothea understood the ILO, and so we really, what Dorothea would keep me from is making assumptions about how the ILO worked, so I'd get some refinement there. So that was very helpful. No, the only problem when you're the born, writer in English and other people aren't, you do a lot of the editing. But
But did you ever feel like Dorothea was constrained by her position as a member?
Yeah, she was for some things. We have one very provocative piece about surrogacy in there, and there were people in the ILO that didn't want that piece. But but at the end they didn't do anything about it. Yeah. So I think maybe it's because women are more marginal than that we could get away with certain things. I don't know about that. But that was a great experience because I got to, meet some people that have become close comrades, colleagues. And we got to have contributions from places you wouldn't think of, like Ghana and Argentina. Although the Latin American countries were quite important in at least passing and ratifying. So yeah, it was really nice.
We've got time for one last question, and this one is from Deborah Cohen, who writes, picking up on what Eric, said, how does the introduction of the pill and better means of contraception impact notion of women workers and care responsibilities?
The ILO deals with what they consider health issues, but only obliquely. The control over one's bodily reproduction, of course, is central to women's emancipation. We've been saying that, at least women in the West, for a long time. And so that is very important. But it's not an issue that's direct. It's the ILO. I have a piece coming out with Magali Rodriguez Garcia in the Journal of Women's History called Indecent Work, Sex in the ILO. And in it, we're talking mostly about sex work, but it's obvious that whether it's with venereal diseases in certain periods or with HIV/AIDS later, the health components about connected to occupational health is more latitude than some other areas in terms of some of these issues. But the ILO hasn't directly dealt with the question of birth control or reproduction, even though some people would talk about it obliquely. Yeah, so that would be bringing, I think it's an important perspective, but it wasn't an issue in this arena.
Thank you. And with that, I'm afraid I have to bring this to a close, but my appreciation to Eileen and to Sonia, co-chair and discussant. And I want to thank those of you who asked questions this afternoon. As I noted earlier, we have another 6 sessions this month and next, and I invite you to join us on Monday, November 23rd at 4 p.m. for the next installment of the Washington History Seminar, this one featuring a new book by George Washington University historian Benjamin Hopkins, entitled Ruling the Savage Periphery, Frontier Governance and the Making of the Modern State. Till then, take care and good night. Thank you all.